Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the issues of the day. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics he was the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College. That's why I started to say that. That was many years ago. And now he teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome.
It's great to be with you, and glad you sorted out where I am.
Yes, I know you're still looking for yourself sometimes, trying to find yourself. Hey, I thought we'd go back into history today and talk about one of the great myths that's promulgated in colleges and high schools and elementary schools all across the country, and that's with respect to the Industrial Revolution. We grow up with this notion that the Industrial Revolution was this horrific period in America's history, that really men hated their wives and their children. Well, they don't put it exactly like that, but that's the implication when they say they sent their wives into the factories and their children in the factories to work long hours, and it was only because of the law that caused women to be spared the horrors of the factories and the children in the factories. So the implication is, husbands and fathers really didn't like their wives and their children. But actually, Richard, it's the libertarians who have really burst through this myth and shown that it is a myth. It's been false since the beginning. That because one reason is because they make the wrong comparison. They compare the living conditions in the 19th century with the living conditions in the 20th and 21st centuries, when really the accurate comparison is what living conditions were like in the 19th century compared to before that. Before that, people lived very short lives, or as Hobbes says, short, brutish, and nasty, or whatever the phrase he used. Life was truly, truly miserable before the Industrial Revolution, but with the Industrial Revolution, people finally had a chance, an opportunity to survive beyond their 20s, to give longer lifespans, and where really the poor were actually going from starvation, rags, to the old phrase, to riches. So really the Industrial Revolution was the opportunity for people to finally break the bonds of poverty. I consider it really one of the most remarkable periods in American history, and really world history. What do you think?
Well, it is absolutely the case that in spite of the mythology and the rhetoric and the misinterpretations, the Industrial Revolution transformed the quality and the standard of life of first a growing number of Europeans, and now into the 20th and now the 21st century, the world. To use an analogy that's often used in many ways, think of a line on a graph that is like the hockey stick, that it is horizontal for a very long length, and then turns vertical at a very steep angle. Now, if one thinks of that, the horizontal part of that historical hockey stick is in fact from the beginning of recorded history, and before obviously, up until around the middle of the 1700s. And that basically was involving a low standard of living, both in terms of the quality of life, the standard of life, the length of life, the very essence of what human existence was on the face of the earth. But then beginning in the middle decades of the 1700s, maybe a bit before in some places in Western Europe, but basically it's not unfair to say around the middle of the 1700s, the 18th century, you start seeing the hockey stick now start vertically rise at a relatively high slope. Now, first in Europe, Holland, Great Britain, then France, then parts of Western Germany, then slowly but surely other parts of Western and Central Europe, and then into Scandinavia. And then, because of the empires that the European countries had, Great Britain, France, and so on, Holland, you then saw this rippling effect of industrialization, rising wages, improved qualities of life, slowly but surely, admittedly slowly, but slowly but surely starting to ripple around other parts of the world due to the influences of the political and economic and cultural institutions in those Western European countries, starting to now influence other parts of Europe and then other parts of the world. Now, what was the difference? You correctly touched upon absolutely some of them. To get Thomas Hobbes' phrase a little correct, nasty, brutish, and short. That is what human life was on the face of the earth for all of human existence up until the 18th and 19th century for all intents and purposes. Human lifespan, you were lucky for the average ordinary person and virtually anywhere, including in Europe or North America. You were lucky if you lived into your 30s and 40s. Most children died before their first birthday. Now, maybe some of the listeners and viewers remember an old TV show called The Bob Newhart Show. Not the old one when he was a psychologist in Chicago, but the later one when he ran an inn in New England. And there were three handymen. They were brothers. And part of the joke was that all three brothers, even though they weren't twins, were named Darryl, Darryl, and Darryl. Now, everybody thought that was funny, right? Three brothers all named the same. But in fact, in earlier centuries, it was not uncommon to name your sons with the same first name. Why? Because many of them did not survive beyond their first birthday. And you wanted some adult male to carry on not just the last family name, but the first name as well. Because chances were that two of the three Darryls would die by the time they were 1 or 2 years old from starvation, illnesses, plagues, wars, a whole variety of circumstances. That changed in the 19th century. Lifespan began to expand. Literacy began to grow. People started being concerned and had the opportunity to make their children literate. This was made possible because of the slow but sure demise of absolute domination of rural life. In the 16 and 1700s, it is not an exaggeration to say that anywhere from 80 to 90, 95%, depending on what part of Europe you're talking about, lived in the rural areas, and only 5, 10, 15% of the population lived in what was at that time urban communities. Most people lived out in the countryside, eking out a living in very harsh, low productive conditions of agriculture, working from the sunrise to the sunset, living in thatched huts in which your animals were kept in the same space as the families living on straw. And in winter, you hugged an animal to try to have the body warmth, to try to keep yourself warm from the elements. If I can just go on with this, Jacob. As I know you know, back in the 1980s, I taught for 2 years in Ireland. And I went to the famous Blarney Castle, where the Blarney Stone is. Yes, Jacob, I went on top of the castle. I leaned over backwards. I kissed the Blarney Stone. And suddenly, as if by a miracle, my stuttering, my stammering was over. And I became articulate to speak. I had the gift of the gab from the Blarney Stone. But besides that, if you look through this castle dating from around the 1400s, if I remember correctly, it was a stone castle with slits cut through the rock for ventilation, and also so you could shoot the crossbow through it if you were attacked. But beyond that, there was no warmth. There were just a few fires and openings in the rock for the smoke to go out. This is how kings lived. Noblemen lived in harsh conditions. When Queen Elizabeth ruled England, Queen Elizabeth I, she was considered to have an exorbitant wardrobe. She had 3 dresses. The Queen of England, they had to be handmade and difficultly out of the materials and the fibers available at that time. Most people had hand-me-down clothes. People died, and you inherited the rags. That also meant that if there were diseases, the bubonic plague spread to those who inherited the clothes, because they didn't understand that fleas carried these diseases, and it came with the dead man's clothes that passed on to you. The other element of this, the amount of illiteracy and ignorance was immense. But with the coming of industrialization, people were drawn to the cities and away from the countryside. Nobody was taken in chains with shackles around their necks. They came slowly but surely freely. Why? Because no matter how harsh, as you pointed out yourself, the factory conditions seen by our modern standards, you were working during your workday in the enclosed shelter of a building, not outside in the natural elements. You had warmth. You had a place to make a living. You had the amenities and comforts of, again, by our standards, rude and crude, but by those standards, shops, clothes, foods, varieties, opportunities. This also meant the beginning escape from the servitude of women. Now, the fact is that before the 19th century, women were basically the property of their fathers or their husbands. The woman could not own property. She could not inherit property. She could not enter into contracts. She basically was the property of the male member of the family. Marriages were arranged. But now women could go to the cities, whether their fathers liked it or not, break away from that locked society and find employment in these factories, because the emerging factory owners, those who had accumulated some savings, incurred the risk of personal or partner investment and needed workers to work with the, again, by our standards, crude, but the industrial machinery of the time. They were looking for workers willing to work hard, admittedly long hours, and for pay that was far better, both in terms of material wealth as well as personal opportunity that the factories offered. And the factory system meant that women began to implicitly enter into contracts. They were earning income on their own. They'd be renting a place to stay. They were entering into relationships, including marital relationships or live-in relationships that were in fact marital relationships without the consent of the father or whether the state recognized it or not. Those de facto market relationships that began to liberate and give opportunities for women then became legitimized in the law in the 19th century as the law followed the emerging practices of the marketplace. Many people often talk about the harsh condition of children in the factories. The fact is, children lived in those rural areas too, living those short lives out in the elements in abject poverty that no American could even imagine living a week in today in modern society. Yes, the children entered into the workforces in the factories as they had worked on the land in the rural areas. Why? Because machines and tools were very crude and unproductive. It's not as if, as you were alluding to sarcastically, parents somehow loved their children less back then. Oh, you're a pain in the butt. Go make your own living. No, parents loved their children then just as today. But parents were not generating enough wealth out of their own work, either in the rural areas or initially in the factories, to generate enough income to sustain another mouth or group of mouths. So the children had to go and work as in the fields and then in the factories at first. But as productivity rose, better and more machines, a growing number of manufacturers competing for laborers, and therefore slowly but surely and not evenly bidding up wages of both men and women, you began to see husbands and wives earning enough that they didn't have to send their children immediately to the workplace once they had motor functions to try to earn their own living. There emerged something that had never been known in history before, Jacob. Childhood. A period of education and innocence before you entered the adult life of work and self-responsibility. Childhood had never been known before. That's what capitalism helped produce. It produced literacy. E.G. West, a famous economic historian, wrote a book called Education in the State. It's a classic. It's kept in print by Liberty Fund of Indianapolis in a very nice edition. He explains in that book that between 1790 and 1830, 2/3 to 3/4 of the entire British population was made literate by what was called the penny press and private education, church schooling, for pay schools, secular educational learning establishments, and people learning by having friends to teach them from reading either the Bible, which is a very common method, or from reading the penny press, because so many people wanted to now read. There was enough for a volume of mass production of cheap, inexpensive newspapers that in Britain were called the penny press. This would cost a penny. All of these things transformed the society. Liberation of women, children being able to have a childhood, growing literacy, rising standards of living. All of this happened during the Industrial Revolution. Now then the question comes up, Jacob. So why is there this image that these were terrible conditions, that was even worse than in the rural life, that going from feudalism to capitalism was somehow going backwards for the average person? This had to do with who was writing the accounts of factory life. Now, there were commissions. In the early decades of the 19th century, there were royal commissions by the House of Lords and some in the House of Commons in Great Britain. But who were the majorities in both the upper house, the House of Lords, and the lower house, the House of Commons? The conservative Tory party, made up predominantly of the landed aristocracy. They're the ones who filled the committees, who called the witnesses, decided what evidence could be offered. And their axe to grind was to show that factory conditions were harsh, brutal, inhumane, insufferable, and that the life on the land, on the nobleman's estate, had been so much better than these factory congested communities in certain cities. That was reinforced. So in other words, a rigged testimony and evidence, a selective evidence to show a biased analyst who had an axe to grind, the landed aristocracy controlling the committees. Then there was Karl Marx. Another imagery, and he himself drew upon these committee reports from Parliament, the British Parliament. But beyond that, he made up things which he incorporated in his famous book Das Kapital, his critique of capitalism. A good number of years ago, two economic historians methodically and turgidly went through Marx's 3 volumes of Das Kapital. And they followed his footnote references and checked the quotes. And what did they find? They found that almost all of his facts about the evils of capitalism and the dehumanizing factory system was based upon either these committee reports rigged by the Tories who ran the committees, or he just made up the quotes. They found that there would be those, like, quoting passages and a quote and then ... and then go on with the quote. Well, they checked what was missing in those dots, and often it was passages in the testimony and evidence that Marx was quoting from that in fact gave an opposite view of what in fact was going on. Now then, based upon all of this and emerging social critics of capitalism, there were several famous economic histories of the Industrial Revolution. A man and a wife couple named Hammond, for example, in the late 19th century. And they all snowballed this. So in fact, the imagery of the 19th century is a rigged interpretation by biased individuals at the time, or those with political and ideological axe to grind, who basically have created a false evidence that has remained the imagery of a wrong interpretation of one of the most amazing periods of human history. Now, I want to be clear, okay, and fair. Was life easy and idyllic? Of course not. There were long hours in the factories. The work was hard and often monotonous. And the machines, given that industrial machinery was only then being developed and introduced, were often difficult to handle and sometimes dangerous in the sense that mistakes could occur and they could break down with human injury. But again, you have to understand that was the beginning of this. That was all they knew. That's what the first inventors came up with and hadn't thought of problems or ways to solve them. It was the first mousetrap. Now, as a consequence of this, it often seems harsh and difficult by our standards again. But by the circumstances of that time and those preceded it, all of these were opportunities for people to rise out of poverty, to have greater opportunity and degrees of personal autonomy that had never been known in history before. All of this set the stage for which we are the lucky beneficiaries of several generations of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. It was a revolution of liberation, not for everyone perfectly or in easy circumstances all at the same time, but cumulatively over a few generations, it gave the world the standard of living that we've taken for granted in the West and is now slowly but surely spreading to the rest of the people around the globe. This is a miraculous event, and we should have no embarrassment or senses of guilt about it. It was the liberation of man from harsh, short, poverty-stricken life.
Yeah, you make a lot of good points. I think it's difficult for Americans today to relate to the way life was before the Industrial Revolution. As you pointed out, the conditions were so horrific. I mean, today, if you lose your job, there's always this backstop. You got some savings that you can draw on. You've got family members that you can go to, maybe private organizations. You got government welfare, which, of course, we as libertarians don't approve of. But if you go back to that period of time, there were no savings. I mean, people knew that every day was a matter of survival. And it was just a matter of trying to get the food to feed your family. And so when you had, say, a famine, you knew that there was going to be a large percent of the population that were going to die because there was no backstop. There was no, hey, well, let me go get some savings from the guy next door, some of his food, because he was eking out his own survival. So you all of a sudden you go into the Industrial Revolution. This was a way to save people's lives, as miserable as it was, as you point out, in the factories. Here, for the first time, a father had a chance to save the lives of his children and his wife by bringing them into an area where all of a sudden they're making a living, they're saving a little bit of money, they're putting it in the bank, and gradually they start saying, hey, now we're on better conditions here. We can afford to have the wife stay at home now. I'm making enough money. Same with the children. Hey, and then all of a sudden, as you point out, different amenities start surfacing. Hey, and now we got time for an education. Now we got time for a childhood. Now we have time for, dresses and suits and better clothing for people. But then the question arises, Richard, what happened here? What was the difference? What caused America and Great Britain to break out into this Industrial Revolution? They were giving poor people a chance to survive and even prosper, become wealthy. And that's really, to me, the remarkable story here, too. I mean, Adam Smith alludes to this in the title of his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. What is it that causes certain nations to be wealthier? And you have all these theories of, the natural resources, a better educated public, and various others. But really the real key was that people were finally free of government control over economic activity. And that's what Smith was suggesting in his book. And so here you have a society that comes into existence in 1791 where there's no income tax, no IRS, no Social Security, no Medicare, no welfare, no economic regulations to speak of, where there was true free enterprise, no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no immigration controls. I mean, imagine all these poor people were fleeing Europe to come to a land where government could not take care of you because there was no welfare, but where they could keep everything they earned, they could start businesses, they could go to work without government interference. And that was the key. That was the key that brought this huge amount of prosperity, productivity, rising wages, capital. That was really what liberated women, liberated children, liberated men, because as people became more prosperous, they became freer in a sense of more choices, more things to do with their life.
Yes, what happened was a revolution in ideas. And it can be seen to have its origins in its modern form in the 1600s and the 1700s. It's expressed in the philosophy that inspired the American Declaration of Independence, but of course was articulated in Great Britain several decades earlier. And that is in political philosophers such as John Locke in his two treatises on government, in which Volume 1 is an attack on absolute monarchy, and Chapter 2, he lays out the philosophy of natural rights, that the individual is unique and distinct and special. He exists in society, but not controlled or sort of a slave to society, that individuals have been made by a creator, and that each individual made by his creator is unique and distinct in his creator's eyes, and that this creator has given him a mind and a body and the ability to reason. And then when you combine that with using that reason to evaluate what is it to be a human being, what are the conditions and circumstances required for the survival of life and the improvement of life, you then see the emergence of this philosophy in its modern form of natural rights that the individual has by his very existence, by his nature, and by being breathed life by a higher authority, a natural right to his life, his liberty, his honestly acquired property through the mixing of his mental and physical labor with resources, or through the peaceful and voluntary exchanges of the market. That the individual is not owned by the king, he is not owned by the collective, he is not a slave to the tribe. This radically transformed the political environment of the society, in which government is the servant and not the master, in which the individual has a right to pursue his happiness, not the society's happiness or the king's happiness or the collective happiness or the group's happiness, his own individual happiness, and that he is free to use his mind and his abilities as he sees fit. Now, this has also been explained with great articulation more recently by an economic historian and classical liberal named Deirdre McCloskey. She has written 2 volumes, one called Bourgeois Virtues, the other is called Bourgeois Dignity, and a 3rd volume, and the trilogy is going to be coming out soon. And her premises is that what also enabled this transformation in society was the political philosophy, John Locke, the founding fathers, the classical liberals of the early decades of the 19th century, but also a cultural transformation that was complement and, in a sense, in the widest sense, inseparable to that. And that was the emergence of what McCloskey refers to as the bourgeois virtues. The idea that an individual should be forward-looking, that he should be self-responsible, that he should save and invest and work hard, and that a person should be treated with respect and dignity and admiration who shows such industriousness and self-responsibility for his family and himself, and takes a voluntary philanthropic concern for the interests of the community based upon his own productivity, not as a command from government, but a sense of this is a proper sense of being a member of a free society. And that these bourgeois virtues became the essence of the meaning of what it was to be middle class. And this too emerged in the 19th century. For centuries before, there had only been, quote, 2 social groups or classes: the nobility, of which the king was the head, and the commoner, who was the serf, the basic day laborer. And then you had a very small handful of people who were the burghers, as they were called, the middle-class merchants, tradesmen, in a very limited number in those isolated villages, the blacksmith, the weaver of clothes, the tradesman. What exploded in the 19th century with this growth of wealth, as we've been talking about, is this massive group of the middle class, the poor, the, quote, working class, to use that Marxian phrase, now had higher standards of living, could accumulate wealth, buy a home, live a more comfortable existence for themselves and their family, start their own businesses, and manifest those bourgeois virtues that they then passed on to their children. This became the hallmark of a free society: self-responsibility, self-help, ingenuity, hard work, savings for the future, leaving something for your children based upon your creative efforts and enterprises. That became the culture of the 19th century. All of that was from these ideas of the 16 and 1700s that enabled capitalism, in the broadest and most free market sense, to blossom and prosper.
Yeah, it goes back to that argument that in order to have a responsible, moral, ethical society, you really need freedom. But with freedom, there are no guarantees. You don't know what the results are going to be, but it's really the only way to achieve a society based on morality and ethics and so forth, because people are having to make choices. And in that process of making choices, they develop a conscience and they exercise conscience, as compared to some people who argue, oh, no, you've got to have responsible people first before they can have freedom. You hear that argument today. Oh, we couldn't free up the American people like by dismantling the welfare state because Americans are just not responsible enough. They're not moral enough. They wouldn't care for the poor. They wouldn't care for seniors on a voluntary basis. So we need to get a morality and responsibility first and then the free society. We as libertarians argue it's the exact opposite, right, Richard? That you want the free society even though people may not be considered charitable, responsible, compassionate, or whatever, because freedom is good for its own sake, even if people are making the so-called wrong choices. But it's in that process of freedom that you nurture the values that all of us think are important.
Yes, this was an issue that even emerged among liberals of the 19th century, by the classical sense, I mean. In his justly famous essay on liberty, John Stuart Mill says that some peoples are not ready for self-rule because they do not have the right characteristics or mental discipline. And until they're ready for freedom, they can only hope for a benevolent Akbar or Charlemagne to rule over them. The other 19th century liberal, Thomas Macaulay, replied to John Stuart Mill and said that he considered Mill's argument to be like the fool in the story who said he would not go into the water until he had learned to swim. You do not learn to swim unless you go into the water and learn to exercise the capacity to stay above water by the efforts to do so. Your point, it is liberty that challenges an individual to exercise his moral conscience and to develop the characteristics that will foster self-independence and self-responsibility and the character of an ethical society.
All right. Well, on that note, we've run out of time, unfortunately. It turned out to be a really good discussion. And unfortunately, let me just wrap up by saying that Americans really abandoned those principles. They took the arguments of the progressives, and we now live under a massive welfare state, a regulated economy under the name of free enterprise and free markets. That's the really funny irony of this thing. And then, of course, the massive warfare state. And people wonder why there are so many recessions and why people are suffering and so forth. And they can't figure out that, hey, when you abandon your founding principles, that in terms of economic liberty, you're going to pay the price. So that's the show for this week. Richard, enjoyed the conversation as always. And we'll see you next week with the next week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Thanks for tuning in.